everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for the second half of Mark chapter 1. Before we get into that, just know, if you're not aware, that all the notes for these classes are available online on tobelikechrist.com. Link is down below. There's also a link to a book that will help you to get your head wrapped around what the Bible is, and it's called What is the Bible? That link's down in the description below as well. So last time we talked about the first half of Mark chapter 1, and this may be actually the shortest episode that we've ever had because I didn't have as much notes on the second part as I thought I did. Let's refresh our minds on the first part before we get into the second part. So we talked about who Mark was. Most people think it was John Mark, traveling companion of Paul and Barnabas, at least for the first missionary journey in the book of Acts. We'll study about that later if you don't know what that is. We talked about how Mark is probably writing to Gentiles. And when we contrast that with Matthew's gospel that we just studied, we see that he leaves off a lot of things that would be really interesting to Jews, like the genealogy, like the family and the tribe and the birth story of Jesus, because that Abraham-David bloodline probably doesn't mean as much to a Gentile as it does to a Jew, almost certainly. So Mark is very to the point, whereas Matthew spends a lot more time in the details. We're going to get to Luke eventually. He's going to spend a lot more time, even than Matthew, in the details. So Mark is a very condensed book, really hitting the highlights. We talked about Jesus' appearance while John was baptizing. Jesus is baptized by John, and then we talked very briefly about the two verses that describe Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. We talked a little bit about baptism, and that picture, at least in part, didn't originate with Jesus. Some of the imagery of that, I guess, the shadowing of that, foreshadowing, began back in the Old Testament with the traditions of the Jews. We talked about the cleansing pools, the mikvah, the ceremonial washing for cleanliness that the Jews practiced. And so when John comes on the scene baptizing people, in some ways, that was a familiar picture. In other ways, it was totally new, specifically in that he was offering, through the future death of Christ, forgiveness of sins. So some similarities and some differences. Let's see what else we talked about. We talked about how John was thrown into prison. Jesus has started his ministry, and he takes up that same banner that John had. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. It was coming to conquer not the Roman Empire, but the real oppressors of the people, and that was sin and Satan's kingdom. Jesus was coming to destroy that, which was a bigger deal than just overthrowing the Romans. And his kingdom would outlast the Romans and all the kingdoms that would come after the Romans. We then discussed how Jesus went into the synagogue. He taught with authority, and the people questioned, how is it that he has such authority to teach? And then he proves that he has the authority to do that, and the backing of heaven behind him when he, with a word, casts out the demon in the synagogue. And we talked about how the scribes who thought that they knew Christ and knew God the Father really didn't know him at all, and they refused to humble themselves to learn. And so that takes us to verse 29 is where we're going to pick up here in this study. Well, let's read verses 29 through 34. And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. So Jesus then departs the synagogue, and he goes to Simon's house, and there Simon's mother-in-law is sick, and Jesus heals her. The text says that she had a fever. And at sundown, all of the people of the city went out with their sick people to find Jesus to be healed. They found him in this house, and a significant number of people. Now, you might ask, well, why did they go at sundown? And this is where knowing a little bit about Jewish culture can fill in some details. And they're not the most important details in the world, but they help you to put together the Bible story. So why did they go at sundown? Well, it's probably because the Sabbath day ended at sundown. The Jews' days ran from sundown to sundown. We think of midnight to midnight. Theirs ran sundown to sundown. And so on the Sabbath day, which was Saturday, they had restrictions per the Old Testament law. They could only walk so far. They couldn't carry burdens. There was some other things. So if you're carrying a sick person, or you have to walk all the way to Simon's house, depending on where you lived, might be farther than the Sabbath day restriction. So when the sun goes down, Sabbath is over, those restrictions are lifted, and then they can go take their sick people to Jesus and not have any kind of conflict with the Old Testament law. So that may be why the text says that they went at sundown. And the Bible says that the whole city was at the door. So this was quite a scene. I think it's interesting when you think about this scene and what it must have looked like, and where maybe we were in this town, and where we were in the bigger picture as far as the entire world. It's interesting to think that Jesus is running this world-changing operation out of a fisherman's house. And probably this was the most unremarkable house anywhere, right? Just the plainest, most normal house that you could possibly think of. And when, not only that, but he's also in kind of the most uninteresting town in the world. There's nothing particularly interesting in world history about the city of Capernaum. And so he's in a suburb of some major city, right? In a normal middle class house, presenting the greatest truth that mankind is ever going to hear. That's weird when you think about it. And the more you think about it, I think the more you realize that's really strange. That's not the way that you would expect it to happen. It's not the way that I would expect it to happen, and I think it's not the way that the people in Jesus' day expected it to happen. The Messiah for them seems like what they envisioned was not what they got, right? I don't think anyone envisioned the Messiah coming like Jesus did, but I don't know. Imagine this scene with me, how odd this would be, and how tempted you would be to be skeptical of Jesus' identity. Imagine, okay, I don't know where you live, but imagine the person that lives 2 doors down from you. Maybe it's your, 2 houses down, maybe it's 2 apartments down, something like that. Right? You probably live in a pretty normal town, pretty normal neighborhood. So let's say, for me, growing up, there was a guy 2 doors down. His name was Larry. So Larry, he was a little weird, but he was a pretty average guy. Okay, average neighborhood. Now, imagine somebody, get your neighbor in your mind. Somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, God is staying down there with Larry. He's spending his time down there. He's sleeping down there at Larry's house." And you say, "Who?" You say, "God. God's staying down there." Or maybe the Messiah's staying down there. This one who's been promised for thousands of years. He's down there at Larry's house. The first thing I would ask you to do is to repeat yourself, because I would have thought that I didn't hear you correctly. And then when I did hear you correctly, I would be highly skeptical, because why on earth would God be at Larry's house? There's nothing special about Larry. And so, sorry, Larry, if you're listening to this, but your neighbor, probably just a regular neighbor. There's no reason for God to come to his house and stay there as if he's the most important man in the world. It's weird. And where was I going with that? Oh, I just want us to kind of appreciate the situation that the people of Capernaum are in, and that the apostles are in. Why we do see some skepticism on the part of the people that lived in that area. I'm not so sure that I wouldn't have been a little bit skeptical as well. But it's just incredible the way that God works, that this was the way that he chose to reveal this eternal truth. It was in the most normal way possible. And I think here's divine truth. It was to be found in the most normal home, accessible to anyone. It was not an exclusive palace that was sealed off only to exclusive Jews or something like that. Literally anyone could have walked down the street and walked to this guy's house, Simon's house. And I think that's a beautiful thing about God's gospel plan, that God's truth can be found in some of the most ordinary places. And sometimes encounter it, and sometimes it can be encountered unintentionally. You can walk into a situation, it's the most normal day of normal days for you, and yet you're presented with the truth. God has providentially offered the opportunity through some normal means. The gospel is communicated or is pictured or illustrated to you somehow. And maybe it's in a place that a person who experiences it would never expect to see it. But those individuals may be seeking the truth, and they may have a life-altering moment where their eyes are opened on the most normal of days. And that's kind of the picture that we see with Jesus. The most normal house in the world has this tremendous truth contained in it, in this tremendous Messiah. So it just takes some time to think about how odd that would be. I think a lot of times we read the Gospels and we see Capernaum and we're like, oh yeah, I know he stayed in Capernaum. And we just kind of have that head knowledge. And so the realities of what that would actually look like if we were on the ground there during the first century and somebody told us, hey, Jesus is down at Larry's house, they don't hit us as hard maybe as they should for how strange that picture would be. But anyway, on the most ordinary of days, a person with open ears can encounter life-changing truth. God's good news moves through the ordinary in extraordinary ways. And I think this ought to be a lesson for us by way of application, that we ought not to discard truth because we deem its origins too ordinary. You might ask, how might someone do that? Well, think about when an ordinary person comes up and presents something new to us. A lot of us have a tendency to judge the information based on the messenger, right? Thinking, oh, well, this person doesn't have anything to teach me. This person is not educated like I am educated. He doesn't have anything new to offer me, and so we discard it. And either of those attitudes, or that attitude in general, would cause us, what would we do with Jesus? If we met Jesus at Larry's house, right? What would we do with him? Oh, he's too ordinary. This is too ordinary. There's no way that's the Messiah. It would cause us to discard Christ. And I think that was primarily, that was a lot of the reason that many people said, no thanks, is because he wasn't what they had pictured, and they weren't willing to open their minds and their ears and their hearts to accept that maybe that's the way that God is going to do things. Sometimes I think we have an idea of the way that God is going to work. He works in another way that doesn't necessarily fit our picture, and we have a hard time accepting it. But don't discard truth because of the messenger. How many people do you think thought that the most important news in the world that affected the souls of all men, past, present, and future, would show up in a fisherman's house in average old Capernaum? How many people do you think expected that? Expected to see it there? Probably zero. Zero people on earth expected that. It was the people who had ears to hear and eyes to see, who were able to recognize truth in the most ordinary place. And the question is, are we open to that same revelation and acceptance of the revelation? The delivery of the gospel has to be one of its most shocking attributes, that God would choose to do it that way. Just no human being would ever think of that. And yet, that's the way that God does it. We see then Jesus, as he's doing these healings and all these people are coming to him, he once again forbids demons from revealing his identity. We're going to see that he kind of keeps that under wraps for a while. We saw that in Matthew already, but we're going to see it again. So let's read verses 35 through 39. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he went through all of Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. So here we find Jesus after a long night, or at least evening, of helping people who were sick and needy. He gets up, rising up early in the morning to spend time with God, his Father, in prayer. And We mentioned this in our Matthew study briefly, but I want to touch on it again here because I think this is a really good picture of it. And that is that there are times when we need to sacrifice physically to make sure that our souls are healthy. And I don't think that's a spiritual discipline that is probably practiced a whole lot. A sacrifice of the physical to feed the spiritual. I think a lot of times we get into the mindset of, oh, if my physical body isn't taken care of, I'm not going to be able to respond spiritually the way that I should. And there's truth in that, don't get me wrong. But Jesus is showing us the priorities here of the spiritual over the physical, and there are times when the physical needs to be sacrificed in order to make sure our spiritual lives are what they should be and that our minds are right and our relationship with God is healthy. And you ask, what does this precedent from Jesus do to our excuses for not praying or not studying or not attending worship or being present to help our brothers and sisters? When we say, I was too tired, or I was too busy, or I did a lot of good work, other good works already today, so I'm going to put off my prayer. I'll do that tomorrow. I'll make up the slack tomorrow. That's one that gets me personally, is that I feel like if I've done enough churchy work in one day, that I don't need to pray so much. That can wait because I've already done a bunch of other spiritual things. I think that's dangerous. And something you need to watch out for, because here we see Jesus, the priority is on both things. Not only on caring for those who needed him, but also the relationship with his Father. And I think those work harmoniously. So, Jesus' precedent here, I think it really renders a lot of our excuses and our tendencies to put off spiritual necessities. It kind of discards those as being not as valid as we often think that they are. Jesus didn't neglect his time with God or his time helping those who needed him. Obviously, this can be taken to extremes, and I'm not pushing it towards any of those extremes. There's a middle ground that we have to find, but a lesson to be learned. So when Jesus' disciples finally find him, they say to him, everyone is looking for you. There's a whole crowd, the whole town's back, probably more sick people to be healed. They were probably thinking, what are you doing down here or over here in this desolate place? We've got this whole crowd who's ready to see you and to be a part of this movement that you're bringing about. And I have a question. You've probably seen it in the media, but the question is, why do so many well-known preachers fall into sin? Maybe or well-known Christians, well-known Bible class teachers. But I think preachers often stand out the most. Why do so many well-known preachers fall into sin? I think part of the reason for that is because they spend too much time with the crowds of people wanting to see them and catering to those crowds, and too little time with God. And you'll often hear that when a preacher repents of something. They'll say, I realized that I was helping all these other people. I got so busy in my ministry that my spiritual life was evaporating. My relationship with God was not what it should have been because I was over here spending so much time with all of these other people. And that's a danger. It's a really tricky danger that the devil puts in front of people who are working in the Lord's kingdom, but it's one that we need to watch out for. The same is true for just Christians in general, obviously. We can be so busy, even busy with good works, that we unknowingly drift away from God because we aren't being intentional about drawing near to him. Jesus responds in a curious way, and I think it's a way that's worth considering. When his apostles tell him that the crowds are waiting for him, he tells them they're not going back to be with the adoring crowds. Why? He says because the gospel needed preached in other places. And you think about that. I mean, weren't there sick people down in Capernaum waiting for Jesus to be healed? The answer is probably yes. Or, wasn't there more good work to do down there with the crowd that he had spent yesterday with? Wasn't there more good works to do? Yeah. But Jesus has priorities, and he brings those priorities to light here, and he puts them in order. Healing sick people was a good thing. It was a good work, but preaching was his priority and was a better thing. That was what he had come to accomplish. Jesus couldn't spend his entire time, or his mission was not just heal all the sick people in the world. It was to preach the gospel. Ultimately, again, we see a de-emphasis of physical sickness. He's saying, that's not really what I'm here for. I'm here for something bigger, and that is spiritual sickness. In order to solve that problem, the gospel needs to be preached. In the same way that he's saying, it's not the Romans that are your problem, that are your oppressors. It's actually sin. It's Satan that's your oppressor. And he's moving towards defeating that bigger thing rather than the physical thing that the people are so focused on. I think this is a really important lesson for the modern church, this difference that Jesus makes between the good and the better, the good and the best. There's a difference between good and better, and I think we really need to make sure that we're giving this some thought. It's a good thing to go to the lake, to spend time with your family, to admire the creation of God. It's a good thing to devote time to learn an instrument. It's a good thing to go to the gym and lift weights and be healthy. It's a good thing to learn a sport and to learn discipline and practicing that sport. And those are all things that will be of value to you in some way in your life. It's a good thing to have a hobby. People got all kinds of hobbies, right? And they're not bad things. They're good things. There's nothing intrinsically bad about any of those things, as long as they're not taken to extremes, right? All of those things are good, and there's nothing inherently sinful about any of them. But maybe the church is struggling. Maybe the church isn't growing as much as it should, because Christians are spending a lot of time doing good things and not enough time doing better things. Here we see Jesus turning down a good thing to accomplish his better and his ultimate purpose. And as followers of Christ, we've been given a similar ultimate priority by Jesus. And what is that? It's the gospel message. It's to defeat the ultimate enemy. It's to share the good news with people so that they can be in Christ, saved by his blood and by his sacrifice. It's our job to get that mission, or to get that message out. That's our number one ultimate priority. And I guess the question that I have for myself and for everyone who's watching is, how often do we choose the good over the better? The Christian life is not always a choice between black and white, good and bad, right and wrong. It's often a choice between good and better. This is where we get in trouble when we see Christianity as the do's and don'ts checklist. Well, as long as I don't do these things, I'm okay. I'm not sinning. But that's, maybe that's a young, immature Christian's view of what Christ has called us to, and maybe that's okay to have for a period of time, but ultimately we need to be maturing into a more mature view of the gospel message and what Christians are called to in the service of the Lord, and that is to get the message out, to preach that message, and that is the decision between good and better. I can do these good things. They're not sinful, but they're not the best thing that I could be doing. And I need to be sure that I'm picking the best thing more often. Everyone can choose the best thing more often than we do currently. Right? So there's application across the spectrum there. But again, not everything in the Christian life is a decision between right and wrong. Sometimes it's a decision between good and better. And here we see Jesus choosing the better, and there's a lesson to be learned there as well. Okay, verses 40 through 45 as we conclude the chapter. And a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling, said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately The leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. So Jesus, during his ministry in Galilee, after he's left Capernaum, is approached by this leper. And if you want to know more about leprosy, I think I have notes on it in the Matthew study. Matthew chapter 8, I believe, is where you'll find those, right after the Sermon on the Mount. Some more details there. You can grab those offline. The leper has a request for Jesus, and I like the way that he approaches Jesus. There's two attributes in his one simple statement that are applicable for us when we make requests of God. And that is the first part of his statement is, if you will, if it's your will. And we need to approach God with that same attitude. I'm coming to you. I know that I'm not the smartest being in this universe. You know better than I do. If it's your will, fill in the blank, right? And the blank that he gives then is, you can make me clean. And there's another attribute in that statement that is really impressive, and that is just an absolute confidence in Jesus' capability to do what he's about to ask him to do. And we need to approach God the same way as James will write in his epistle. Confidence that you're coming to a God that has all the power in the world to do anything that he wants to do, and he's seeking the good of his children and will do what is best for you. Right? So in both of that is a God-glorifying, honoring prayer. If you will, I'm submissive unto your will. You can make me clean. You have the power to do it. I'm submissive under your power. I trust you to be my father. I trust that you're a better gift giver than an earthly father, as it mentioned in Matthew, to give me what I need. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. We should approach God the same way. The text says, I like this. It's so easy to skip over, but I think it communicates so much about Jesus. When it says, Jesus' response, it says, and Jesus was moved with pity. He stretches out his hand. Why? Because he's moved with pity. The text doesn't have to say that. But I find it interesting that it doesn't just say he did this for his own glory. Certainly the miracle was for Jesus' own glory, for God's glory. But it was also motivated by pity that he had for the man. Jesus, who has never sinned, has pity on those who live in a world that is affected by the consequences of sin. And I find that amazing in light of my human nature. He could have easily said to this man, well, you know what, man, you've sinned too. You've contributed to the sin of this world, and so this is what you get. You know, this is your fate, because you know what? You helped create this world too. So let me clarify there. I'm not saying that this man had leprosy because of some sin in his past. The Bible doesn't teach that disease works like that. But we know that disease and suffering entered the world as a result of sin. So he lives in a sinful world, and the book of Romans tells us that all men have sinned. So he's contributed to this world. It would have been easy for Jesus to look at him and be like, you're a sinner. You made the world this way. You helped make the world this way. So this is what you get, and then just walk away. But that's not what we find. I look back at my life, and I realized that I used to have very little pity on people that were affected by sin, especially when those people were caught up in sin themselves. Used to look at them like I just described, Jesus could have looked at this man. Well, that's what you get. Not going to live God's way. You're going to suffer. You're going to have things go wrong in your life. You're going to, whatever had happened to these individuals. That's what you get. I didn't have any pity on those people who are caught up in sin, because I didn't understand. How could you How could you be that dumb? How could you live? How could you be so addicted to this or that or whatever, and live a life that just foolishness and rebellion to God? How can you be that way? And it wasn't until I had a period when I was caught up in sin that my pity started to increase, because I began to understand, oh, this is how someone gets caught in this. Oh, this is the affections, the tearing of the affections between loving God and loving the world, and not being able to give up what you're holding on to in the world. And it was when my heart was torn in half by those two affections, and by the grace of God has made some recovery. It wasn't until that happened that I started to have compassion for people. Not just for people caught up in the same sins that I was, but people who are caught up really in any sin. To be able to understand, it's hard. It's hard to live the way that God wants you to. The devil is good at his job. He can make you fall in love with these things out in the world. And I understand now what it's like to be in that position. But until then, I had no pity for the people that were. Thank God that God is not like me, right? Because here's Jesus, comes on the scene, never sinned, never contributed to the nastiness of this world. And yet he finds pity in his heart for this man. And that's why he heals them. Because he sees him, he sees the results of sin, he sees the suffering that's come upon this man because of the sin that's in the world, and he has pity on him. And I think that says so much about who Jesus is, and how he cares for us, even though the truth be told, we're in this situation because we've contributed to a world that looks like this. So the text says that he was it says then, where am I at in my notes? Oh, there it is. My scroll wheel went down. Jesus stretches out his hand to touch a contagious man, and he takes away the effects of sin. And you think about that picture. All of Jesus' healings, in a way, are a picture of his greater work. Sickness and suffering enter the world because of sin, and Jesus' healings are individual pictures of his conquest of sin's consequences. So here on an individual level, Jesus is taking away the consequences of sin. He has the power to do that. What's Jesus' ultimate purpose? It's to take away the big consequences of sin, right? So he's taking away these little ones, sicknesses and demons and troubles. But what is he after? He's after the big fish, Satan's two powerful weapons, which are what? Sin and death. That's what he has to conquer in order to be the king, and eventually that's what he's going to get to. And though, death is the consequence of sin, Jesus is going to take that away, just like he took away this man's leprosy. So here we have little pictures of the big plan of Jesus. Now, let me ask another question. I think this is, we're getting close to the end here. Why did Jesus tell this man not to tell anyone if he knew that he was going to tell people? I think this is a question a lot of people have when they come to a text like this. Why does Jesus do things, if he's all-knowing, why does he do things that he already knows the answers to, right? Or he already knows the outcome of something? Why does Jesus mentor Judas if he knows that Judas is going to betray him? Why does Jesus preach to people that he knows aren't going to listen? Why are they called to repentance if he knows that they're not going to repent? I think when we look at Jesus, there are a lot of things that Jesus probably does for our benefit and our learning, even though he already knew the answers or the outcome to those things. And if you think about, what if Jesus didn't do that? If Jesus never humanized his interactions, his actions would probably be super confusing, right? Because people would come up to him He would already know the question that they're going to answer. He goes ahead and answers those questions before they ask them. We have those recorded in the scriptures, and we're like, wait, what is that an answer to? What, right? Or Jesus doesn't kind of follow through with the natural human progression of a conversation or a set of actions, right? The Bible would get really confusing really fast. And so I think Jesus, obviously knowing the limits of humanity, he had to be a God who acted human. And so that meant, although he knew maybe what somebody was going to ask, he permits the question to be asked anyway, in order to make it understandable for us. And I think the same thing is probably going on here when we see Jesus telling a man not to do something, but ultimately he goes out and does it anyway, and Jesus knew that ahead of time. But we get the picture and are able to understand it, being not omnipotent or omniscient, all-knowing. And one final question before we conclude here. And that is, why are, here in this picture we see all kinds of people, a whole town coming out to see Jesus. Why are people not as interested in Christ today, in coming to Christ and getting to know Christ, as they were back here in this first century picture, right? We don't have whole towns flooding into church buildings to be introduced to Jesus. Why is that? Well, I think there's a couple reasons. The first one is that people are not as in tune or in sync with their spiritual needs as they are with their physical needs. When a person is physically sick, it's inconvenient to their lives, and we feel our physical ailments very keenly. We often don't feel our spiritual needs nearly as much, or that they need the immediate attention that our physical needs do. So we're less likely to seek out that attention. And the second is in regards to the time frame of what Christ does for us. Let's say it that way. Let me explain. Jesus' remedy for spiritual needs requires serious long-term commitment. And I think that's part of the reason that not as many people are coming to know Christ today. I think many people in the world feel the symptoms of spiritual sickness. They know that something's wrong. Maybe they feel a void that they can't fill. Maybe they feel something is missing in their lives. Maybe they realize that they're not finding satisfaction in the way that they're living. There's something else here. They feel that symptom of spiritual sickness, but they don't know necessarily what to do about it, or maybe they're not willing to make the commitment. They often seek the wrong medical advice, which enables them to make the wrong decision. Let me explain that concept. My wife is a nurse practitioner and has worked in the hospital for quite a few years now as a nurse. But there's a lot of people that go to the doctor that are seeking some kind of remedy for an ailment. And what they really want when they go to the doctor is a prescription for some kind of pill that is going to take away their symptoms. And many doctors are more than happy to just prescribe something and send people out the door. Less trouble for them, less time commitment for them, and their patients. A lot of them like that because it seems like a really easy fix. Oh, excuse me. I just take this pill, and I don't feel the pain anymore. The problem with that type of treatment, though, a lot of times, is that many pills don't actually treat the underlying problems. They treat the symptoms, the outward symptoms, the immediate symptoms. They kind of mask over those, but they don't solve the root problems, the thing that's actually giving the person those symptoms. And when a doctor tells somebody that they won't prescribe them a pill, instead, they're going to prescribe some kind of lifestyle change to address the underlying issues, people are often less likely to be happy with that answer versus the, hand out a prescription. It's not uncommon for a person to request a doctor that they know is just going to give them a pill, rather than one who's going to tell them, well, if you're going to make this any better, you really need to change this, and this in your life, and that's going to take long-term commitment, right? Don't want to hear that answer. Just give me the pills. And the same is true, I think, for our spiritual ailments. The devil passes out pills. Plain and simple, right? The devil runs a pharmacy. He wants you to come to his pharmacy and get his pills. He wants to offer you a quick solution to your problems. He doesn't want you to get to the root of the problem, because then you're going to realize that Jesus is the only thing that can offer you what you're actually looking for: long-term, real root solutions. Satan wants you to find a quick temporal solution that keeps you distracted from the real problem. And you just think about the world, how good he is at doing this. People have some void in their heart, and what do? They don't do a self-evaluation of, what deep things do I need to change about myself. Satan says, don't think about it that much. Go out and get some high that'll satisfy you for tonight, or a couple days, and that'll take care of it. And you know what? A couple days later, you can do it again, right? What is he doing? He's passing out pills. Simple solutions to mask symptoms. Jesus, though, is that doctor who offers you that lifestyle advice. He requires significant commitment. The Christian life is hard. He doesn't water it down, right? It's hard to do. He offers the only real solution, though, that lasting remedy to the problem of sin and death and dissatisfaction with the world. But we have to be serious about that. And I think that's part of the reason. When Jesus was healing in those towns, it was immediate, right? And people like that. But now that we're in a spiritual situation rather than a physical one, the solution offered by Jesus requires much more commitment. And so people aren't as interested in coming to him to commit to something like that, when the devil will offer them something much easier, even though his solution will eventually kill them, like a lot of pills. Too many people are flooding to Satan's drive-through pharmacy to pick up a quick high, instead of coming to God for the advice that they need. So that's the second half of Mark chapter 1. That went longer than I thought it would. Nothing surprising there. That's typically how it goes. But remember, grab those notes offline. We're going to do chapter 2 next. Already working on that. Been working on it with my wife. She's going to be doing some studies as well through her online study group, maybe on YouTube as well. Not sure. We're going to try to put together some books when we finish up the Gospel of Mark for study, a future study, and to allow you guys to study with other people and to get a deeper study for yourselves, more than what I can offer in the time period that I have in these videos. So look forward to that. And again, there'll be the notes that are available when the study is done. So thank you everybody for watching. I know that some of these videos are long and take some commitment to watch these and keep up with this series, but I know that there have been a lot of people who have, and I commend you for doing that, and I thank you for supporting me and looking at my ugly mug for an hour every 2 days. But thank you, and I will see you guys in the next video.